Okay, I am now going to hit the start webinar button. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. And we're just going to give it a minute or so to allow everybody to jump on board, and then we will get started. Thank you so much to everyone who's just joined us. We're just giving it another 30 seconds or so to allow other people to join the webinar. We can already see quite a few people coming in already, which is fantastic. So we'll just allow another 30 seconds or so for everyone to join, and then we will get started. Alrighty, I think it's time to kick things off. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to everyone for joining our first webinar of or should I say Intopia's first webinar of 2023. My name is Chris Pycroft, and I am a part of the team here at Intopia, and I will be your host for today's webinar. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're all dialing in from this webinar today. And pay my respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we have participating in this webinar or watching it on demand. Please do feel free to drop into the chat to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which you are joining us from today. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before I throw it over to our main presenter. And so if you have any questions that pop up throughout the webinar today, please do submit them through the Q&A feature that is available on the bottom of the screen. There will be time to answer them at the end, so please do drop them in through that Q&A feature. If you do happen to need to leave the webinar part of the way through, that is absolutely okay. We are recording this webinar, and we will be making a recording of the webinar available through Intopia's YouTube channel shortly after the event. Apologies if you're hearing any background noise. There is currently a storm coming through our area, and I just heard a bit of thunder and lightning outside of my ear. I'd also like to acknowledge that there is live captioning that is available through this webinar, and that captioning is being provided by AI Media. Today is the first webinar of the year, and it is the start of 2023. We know that it will be a big year on the accessibility front. We know that there'll be things such as innovation in technology. We know that there'll be revisions to guidelines, and we know that there will be so many things that will be happening in the accessibility space this year. So this will hopefully be the first of many webinars that we produce throughout 2023. Plus, we will have a whole bunch of different content and resources that we'll be publishing throughout the year on the Intopia website. Obviously, today's webinar focuses on design, and for anyone that is interested in learning more about designing for accessibility, little spoiler alert, I will have a couple of announcements to make at the end of the webinar. But with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Claire. Claire is a digital accessibility consultant who has been with Intopia for 3 years and supports our training, accessibility auditing, web design, as well as our accessible design consultation services. Claire is the co-creator of the annotation toolkit, which she'll be talking about in her presentation today, and has been involved with the design work of many of our resources, including the Not checklist, which we launched last year as a part of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Claire has a strong passion for inclusive design, as well as accessibility and inclusion. And with that, Claire, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Crispy. Welcome, everyone. As Crispy introduced, we're tackling annotation. Today, we'll be looking at how we can annotate designs for accessibility. So we'll spend a little bit of time up front talking about the why using annotations. I'm sure I've dragged your attention all here today, so you probably have a good understanding of the benefits, but it's really good to explore how we can communicate the benefits with the rest of our team, how to encourage people to use these practices a little bit more. And then we'll have a little bit of a dive into what we should annotate at different stages, different parts of our designs. So let's start first. Why should we use annotations? We may have seen before the shift left model, which is common across DevOps and Agile methodology, which encourages quality to be addressed as early on in the process as possible. When it comes to accessibility, though, even if we are using more of a shift left model in the rest of our Agile DevOps, quite often accessibility is still the opposite and it's left to the end, quite often forgot about. And it can be quite an expensive and time-consuming process when it is all the way over to the right there, left to when we're deploying and releasing things, or after everything's deployed and released, and then tackling accessibility. So bringing that with everything else into that shift left model, bringing accessibility more upfront. There's a lot we can do as designers to help drag accessibility back to the forefront of that software development lifecycle and get everyone thinking about it at all stages, but particularly right at the start when we're writing requirements, planning and designing. I'm sure this is another graphic that you may have seen quite often when we're looking at the cost of rework. Accessibility is no exception here. It's everyone's responsibility, and a lot of accessibility defects can be avoided at the design stage or earlier. So we're looking at the cost of rework, changes, defects, bugs that are found in that post-product release can be around 30 times more expensive than if they were addressed at the design and architecture stage. So that's what we're kind of planning to do with this annotation concept, is bringing more thought when it comes to accessibility right at the start, so we can avoid that costly cost of rework when we're looking at it right at the end there. So by annotations, we're really talking about just further documentation for the design. So like an architectural blueprint, we want all the information to be clear and there right at the start. So if we imagine like an architectural blueprint, if we were building a house and something was missing critical at the start of the plan, like where a critical support wall should be, and then we build the house and that information is missing, the whole house might fall down, which is a great analogy for accessibility. We want to make sure that key decision making when it comes to the accessibility of our product is right there in the plans at the start. So we're creating that consistent documentation, creating that common understanding across the project of what's required for accessibility, what our responsibilities are. And via using annotations, we want it to be really easy to act upon. Feedback I've gotten for a lot of designers is that quite often it's very time consuming and to have documentation around designs, and it can be sometimes quite laborious adding things onto a design. So by making our accessibility toolkit, we're trying to make it as easy and quick as possible to mark up and annotate design. But this is just something we're going to have to bring together, make more time for at the start, and work together as a team to make sure we're looking at accessibility early and making sure there is time allowed for that. When we're thinking about some of the benefits of annotations as well, as I mentioned, saving time, which saves money when we're looking at accessibility right up front, it also brings those conversations up front and brings more eyes across accessibility. So the more people looking at something, the more chance you'll catch something before it becomes a bigger problem later. The more eyes you can get across something to review it before a decision's made, instead of a hasty decision at the end to fix an accessibility product post-release. Also builds that sense of collaboration when you're working on documentation and planning together at the start, particularly building collaboration between your design team and development team. An additional thing we've found is that it can really help build test cases as well. The more documentation you have for your design, the easier it's going to be for your QA team. And that's the same with accessibility. The more stuff we build in the documentation up front, the easier it's going to be to help build test cases and test accessibility a bit later on as well. And making it really clear what's going to be required for accessibility. So it kind of makes everyone's job a little bit easier as we snowball along. Another thing, just generally when we're doing this kind of practice, it increases the accessibility knowledge across the organization as a whole. Instead of being that thing that one person does in the team, everyone's kind of getting their eyes across it, seeing this accessibility stuff. And the more we put it into practice, the more people are seeing it regularly, the more it becomes just a standard way of working, building that baseline knowledge across the organization and embedding accessibility into the way of working. Awesome. Let's kick off with what should we annotate? We're keen on annotations now. We've heard a little bit about why they can be really successful. What should we dig in and start annotating at the design stage? So all of the examples today will be using our own annotation kit that Chris mentioned at the start, which you can find in the Figma community if you go in there and search our Intopia page, or Chris will drop a link in the chat if you just want to go in and have a look now while I'm talking. One thing to keep in mind though is that no matter what you decide, it'll be a chore if you don't if it doesn't already fit into your team's workflow. So have a think about what you currently do, what kind of things you document, how you document things, and choose a process that will fit comfortably within that. Starting something brand new that's total opposite of how you normally document stuff can be more time consuming and more of a chore to complete. So I'll be showing specific examples of ways of annotating things, but these concepts can all be adapted to be documented in different places in different ways, depending on how you're already documenting design decisions. So let's start with UI component states. It's a really good place to start when it comes to documenting accessibility because you're already creating different states for components. We just need to make sure we're thinking about what states are required for accessibility and making sure that the states created are accessible at this stage. So thinking about what states we already have there, checking them to make sure they're accessible, and adding in extra states that you may not already have. This may be something that is documented at the component or design system level if you have one. So starting with hover and focus is a great place to start. You may already be designing hover states, but quite often people will occasionally forget about keyboard focus states. It's something really important to design up front and not leave to chance. Don't let their browser control what your focus states look like, and make sure they're going to be beautiful and accessible, highly visible over any background colors you may be using across the site. And it's a good way to test and have control over these things right up front. So ensure that these states are checked over for contrast in particular. One thing we really want to make sure is that the text contrast is maintained in every state. It's quite common for text contrast to perhaps get a little bit too light on a hover state or a keyboard focus state. We want to make sure that the text is really easy to read no matter what state we're in, and that we have a beautiful clear focus indicator that has strong contrast. As I mentioned, have a think about what background colors they may be used on, what colors you have available in your brand palette. Are there people perhaps going to use one of these buttons on a wildly different background color in different situations? And will those hover and focus states still be really clear in those scenarios? Selected states are really important as well. So similar to the hover and focus, we want to make sure that the contrast is maintained in every state. And we want to make sure will someone be able to easily tell something is selected. So on screen, I have an example of some checkboxes in their unchecked and checked states. While they're static, they have hover with the mouse and focus with the keyboard. So we really want to make sure in all those states that everything's nicely maintained, it has strong contrast. Someone can easily tell what state it's in, whether it's checked or unchecked, but also the selected state is nice and clear as well. So we're not relying on just a color change. There's nice, strong contrast, so that someone can really easily tell the difference between the selected and unselected state. With errors and different combinations, so ensure you're covering additional states. So such as errors, ensure that you've covered error states for relevant components, what happens if something goes wrong, and how your users recover from that. So making sure that these states are accessible as well, set similar concepts to the previous two, making sure we're not relying on just color change to show our error states. They're nice and easy to see. Having a think about where your error text cases are documented. Are you documenting these in a specification? Do you have a table of common error message text that can be worked over to make sure it's really highly accessible? Are there unique error text conditions for a certain page you're designing? This is a really sticky place when it comes to accessibility, because we want to make sure we're not having that drop off when people can't recover from an error. And having a think about where the errors are displayed, how long are they going to be shown for, what happens to your focus management when an error displays. There's lots of decisions when it comes to error states on components. And make sure you're also covering combinations of states. This is something that often is where some accessibility problems will come in when you're combining some states together because they weren't designed for in the first place. So on screen, I have an example of a combination error state where we have an error and a focus on a text field. So this is one that I often come across, that there'll be problems where you can't see that something has keyboard focus because there's already an error state there. So making sure you're thinking about those combinations of states, and that when you've combined two states together, that everything is still beautiful and accessible. So whether you have a design system or a set of brand colors, ensuring your palette can be used in an accessible way is essential. So give your team some clear guidance around colors and how they should be used. This can be documented in a variety of ways. So whether you have a beautiful design system documentation or just a reference chart that shows when you can use what colors and what situations. But when it comes to doing this in the first place, it can be really labor intensive. So I recommend using some of my favorite tools when it comes to automate this process for you. Otherwise, it can take quite a significant amount of time matching up all your brand colors to work out which ones are going to make accessible color combinations. So in these tools, you can input all the colors of your palette, anything that you can use or have available as part of your design, and it will create a whole guide for you of what colors can be used together to create strong contrast, whether that's for UI components or large text or regular sized text. The best three that I recommend trying out, if you haven't used them before, are the ones I have on screen are called, there's a components.ai, accessible color design, and contrast grid. And we'll have those links available in the chat for you if you want to check them out, or there will be, if you're watching the recording, we'll make the slides available and there'll be some links at the end there. So the components color lab system one was my favorite when I've been using these, because you can change the output to be a whole bunch of different views. So the view I'm showing on screen is a tabular view that shows each of my colors and then has an accessible color guide pair on the side, so you can quickly reference a color that you want to use and then see all the colors that go with it that create good contrast. So these tools can be really handy. Decide on the best location, as I mentioned, where to document this information that makes it easily available to all your team, whether that's some kind of external documentation or documentation within your design tool. Create a reference point where designers can easily find and look up accessible color combinations when they're creating new things. Keyboard patterns and interactions is another one that may be best documented at the component or the design system level. So when we're creating any custom components, we want to make sure we have their keyboard interactions well documented and understood up front. These can be things that are kind of tricky or sticky to change once they're already being developed. So the earlier we can have a look at our keyboard patterns, get them checked over, the best result we'll have at the end. This also creates a really handy guide for testing things later, particularly if you are, say, updating a component in the future and you want to test the keyboard still working, you'll have a whole guide there of how we expect the keyboard to work. If you need some help with this process, particularly if you don't use the keyboard a lot or need some guidance, I recommend referencing the Authoring Practices Guide, which has extensive documentation on how the keyboard should work for various components. On screen, we have an example of a menu button. So this is a good place to document something like keyboard interactions because it's more of a custom component. So we have some annotations where when the menu button's closed in its normal static state, we can see what keyboard controls will open the menu button. In this case, enter or space. And then once it's open, we have a lot more stuff to document. We have a shortcut key where we can press escape to close it again quickly. We can use our up and down arrows to move through the selections in the menu button, the menu items. We can press enter or space to activate a menu item once we're on there. And then some bonus ones using the home key and the end key to jump to the first or last item in the list. So lots of things to document, but it creates that really easy guide later on. Content order is another one that perhaps at the component or design system level, you may occasionally have special rules for content order. I don't recommend going wild when it comes to content order, but there may be times where something comes up that you may need some special content order rules. One that comes up a lot for me, particularly, are things like cards, where you may have stuff above the heading of the card, say a splash image, or in this case, the example I have on screen, we have a date above the heading of the card, followed by some tags, a text description, and a CTA link. So for users who are navigating by headings, we don't want them to miss out on the date information or it sounded a little bit janky when we're navigating. So we kind of want the visual order to mismatch a little bit with the code order so that the heading comes first, followed by the date. This is a great place to document those decisions to make sure that someone's going to be able to test for it. We've made a decision up front. Everyone's aware of how the card should work. So we've annotated up this card with the reading order tags that will show that the heading of the card should come first in the content order in the code, followed by the date. And then the rest of the card can match the natural visual order, showing the tags, the text description, and the CTA link. Page titles is another area that's really helped out by documentation. So if you have a smaller site, you may be choosing a page title at the page level. You may only have a few pages and you may want to document that on a page-by-page basis. Or if you have a larger site, you may want to have some standards around page title formats. So the page title, for those that haven't encountered this before, is what's displayed up at the top in your browser bar here. This can be a really important wayfinding tool for users in general to orient themselves. That can be particularly important for screen reader users because it's the first thing that's announced when you navigate to a new page. So you're sure you're in the right place when you're navigating. So some options, as I mentioned, if you have a big site or a design system, you may want some formal documentation around how page title should work or a specific format or method used to generate a page title. This example on screen is from the New South Wales Education site. That's showing their page title guidelines, which has really thorough information about how to write a really good page title, how to write navigation labels, URL guidelines, how-to guides, heaps of information in there that really thoroughly documents how they want all that stuff to work. Or if you have a smaller site and you just want to make sure you're setting your page title per page level, you can use things like annotations. I have an example here where I'm using a note annotation just to dictate what I want the page title to be on a demo site. So for this example here, we have Intopia webinar, annotating designs for accessibility -Intopia. So we've got the name of the article first and then the site name at the end. Page regions is another good one to investigate. This may require a little bit more collaboration between designers and developers, particularly if you don't know a lot about code or about how page regions work. Identifying and documenting regions in your designs can be really important. It does save a lot of time and heartbreak later when things aren't working quite the way we expect post-release. So if you haven't worked with page regions before, essentially when we're designing, we're blocking content out visually so that you can clearly see where the header is, where the footer is, what's key navigation. We're using visual cues to show this information, but we can also make those visual cues documented in the code so that a screen reader can have those same, a screen reader user, sorry, can have those same advantages by identifying where the different regions are of the site and be able to jump to them really quickly. So we can, when we're designing, identify those regions that we've designed for visually. So on screen, I have a little demo site of the Intopia website where I've highlighted the different areas where I've created regions. And then I can add some little notes on the side to let people know why I've added these. So I've added a little landmark to show where the header is of the website, that I have a search region as part of the header. I also have a navigation region and my main content underneath. So with landmarks as well, when you have multiple landmarks of the same type, it's good practice to give them labels so that the screen reader users can hear which navigation regions, which, for example, so in this case, I know that I'll have multiple navigation regions on my site. So I've given it a little note in my annotation that I want it to have a label of site because that's my site navigation as opposed to perhaps a different navigation region I have further down the page. Scott has a question in the chat related to this with page regions. Do you recommend having a screen reader heading? So there's a heading structure that can be jumped to. So with page regions, Scott, you can have a footer region already set to contain your footer so that when a screen reader user jumps from, say, your main content and moves into the footer, it'll announce that it's a footer. So that's a really handy way of doing it. It's just marking up all your footer in a footer region, and that way it's all done for you. You don't have to have a particular heading. Also, the screen readers have a special menu where they can bring up all the different regions on the page. So if they do want to jump down to the footer, they can easily do that. Awesome. Hopefully that helped with that one, Scott. Let's jump over to images. So another place at a page level or perhaps at the design system level, depending on what type of image we're looking at, is making sure we've documented all our text alternatives that conveys the meaning of informative images so that everyone can have a input on things depending on their role. Perhaps you've got content copywriters that need to have inputs on alternative text for particular things, or if you're using a CMS, perhaps you have to make sure there is a way for your developers to build in the ability for authors to add alt text. So it's a really important thing to consider upfront how you're handling images. If you have a really large site, what are the rules around them? Establishing some kind of documentation. It's also really handy to have some kind of internal guide that helps people write good alt text if you have a lot of different authors in different areas writing alternative text, and a little handy guide around when you need to add it, when you don't need to add it, etc. So at a component level, there may be times where you have informative images. The example I have on the screen is a little card for social media links, and I have 3 buttons, one with a Facebook icon, a Twitter icon, and a LinkedIn icon. So this might be something you have a common social media CTA block where you want to make sure it has some really nice alternative text. Here I've just annotated it with some alternative text to make it really clear. I have Intopia on Facebook, Intopia on Twitter, and Intopia on LinkedIn. So it's nice and clear where we're going for those 3. At a page level, you may have times where you need lots of eyes over alternative text. You may have more complicated alternative text. It's where it's good for that contextual information to have it at a page level in your designs. Here I have a little page all about Intopia pets. I've had some volunteers send me their pet photos to include. So for this type of thing, we want the alternative text to like show some personality of our pets. So I've had a few people write some examples for us, but then we could go back and workshop to make sure that they're all kind of matching and describing our pets in a nice, fun way. So I've got my pets at the top, Louie and Lucy and Nero, the cat, and some little alternative text just to describe what's going on in the picture. We've included things like what breed the dogs are, what colors they are, what they're doing in the photo. And then under that, we have Angus, Lily, and Floki, the 3 dogs. So really these types of things where perhaps you want your brand language or your copy team to have input on alternative links at that page contextual level, it's really great to have it annotated to the side of the design so that people are thinking about it, people are seeing it, and the right people have eyes over it before it's gone off into production. Focus order is another great page level one where we may want to be documenting page level interactions that come in when we're looking at focus order. So we really want to make sure for keyboard and screen reader users that we're looking at the order of focus for complex things, also focus management. Don't worry, you don't have to document your whole focus order on your page. Just try to think about where there may be complex non-standard interactions where you have to make a particular decision about the order of your keyboard focus, or there's something to do with focus management where you need to think about where's the focus going to go when this happens or where it's going to return to. So in this example, we've annotated up the focus order for contact us modal. So the modals appeared and we have a little guide showing us where the tab order should be for the keyboard, starting at the top of the modal at the close button, then moving through the 3 text boxes. Then there's a cancel button and a send button. So we've added some documentation on the side to show with the keyboard focus, we have some notes to indicate the modal should trap the keyboard focus. So we shouldn't be able to access the page underneath. The focus should start at the top, moves through the modal, and then is circular until the modal closes. We also have some extra notes there coming back to our keyboard interaction patterns, letting us know that the escape key should close the modal, some important keyboard shortcut information there, and then letting us know also where the keyboard focus should go when we're done with the modal again. So once we've closed the modal, there's a contact us button that triggered the modal in the first place. We're just letting people know that's where the focus should go back to once we've closed the modal. And lastly, one important thing to think about is, have you added any features or made any decisions that support accessibility? So anything particular you've thought about or added for accessibility, it's great to annotate it or document it somewhere clearly, because you don't want something inadvertently removed or changed that you added for a specific accessibility purpose, just because people weren't aware why that feature was there. So here we have an example of a skip to content link where it's we have some notes on the side with our annotations showing that it's displayed on keyboard focus. It moves to the main heading of the page when we've activated it. So some notes about how the interaction pattern should work, and then documenting where it is on the page and what it looks like. Some other examples of other features you may want to document in this way are things like if you've added a specific pause play control to meet an accessibility guideline, or you have a video component that has a transcript block below it and you have some rules around making sure that all the video content has transcripts, or perhaps you're using a gesture in a mobile app and there's an alternative feature to make sure we're not just relying on gesture support, and that's added there specifically to solve that problem. You don't want someone to inadvertently remove it. So documenting why it was there, why it was added, and how important it is really good practice. So you might be thinking that was a lot of stuff to annotate. That's a little bit overwhelming. What should I do now? Don't worry, just the important thing when it comes to anything with accessibility is just have a try and start with something small. So give an annotation kit a try out ours or one of the other existing annotation systems. The one we showed today, as I mentioned, is published in the Figma community under Intopia, and the link's in the chat as well. You also have the option, if you have a really big complex design system and you want something to be built into that, have a go at making your own. If you have something that better suits your existing design system processes or documentation, just start small, particularly if you're daunted. Don't worry too much. Just pick one thing that you can start that will have a lot of impact and get the ball rolling. It's easy just to start with something small and build some momentum and get into the practice of documenting and working with accessibility, and then build up larger as you go. Accessibility is all about momentum. Just lead the way and start talking and thinking about accessibility as part of your designs, and it will pick up momentum as you go and become a standard practice quicker than you think. As I mentioned, the slides will make available when the recording comes up. So there will be some of the resources we posted in the chat will be available afterwards. If you missed out on them, don't worry. We'll make them available later for you. But I think I've seen some questions come through in the Q&A, Crispy, if we're ready for a few more questions.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Claire. I really, really do appreciate it. And thank you for your time. This was an incredibly interesting presentation and so many things to kind of unpack. And we do have probably about 20 or so minutes for questions. So please do keep the questions coming in because we've got a fair amount of time for them. Just before we get to those questions, I'm just kind of curious just to ask you one myself, Claire. I can see you've still got that slide on the screen where it says start small. And quite often, if you just want to pick one thing, that one thing can end up potentially being a little bit bigger than what it is that people might be expecting it to be. But also you do want to kind of make the most meaningful impact where it's kind of like, right, this is my demonstration to prove why this is really important kind of work. What do you think are some of those key things that, you know, if people are overwhelmed for choice, it's like, right, this should be my starting point because this will have a really good impact?
I think images is a really good one to start because it's one that requires often a lot of communication and decision making. So that can be a really good one to start with because it will help you build all those skills in terms of thinking about accessibility and being challenged in the right kind of ways. So including images would be a really good start. I saw someone in the chat mention headings. I didn't put headings in this presentation because it's something I talk about quite a lot, but there is heading annotations available as part of the kit. So looking at heading structure is a really nice one to start with too. If perhaps you don't use a lot of images in your website that you're designing, just looking at just heading structure. There are heading annotations as part of the toolkit as well. So thinking about, yeah, headings or images are probably the ones I'd recommend having a go at first.
Yeah, perfect. And that's actually a really good segue into our first question, actually. This one popped into our chat a little bit earlier. It was a question from Kyle. Kyle asks, when you get to headings, are the H1, etc. tags relevant in apps?
So when it comes to building mobile apps, whether it's for iOS or Android, it's kind of a little bit different to web in that in web, there's heading 1 through heading 6, and we want to make sure the headings form a nice hierarchy. When it comes to apps, it's either a heading or not a heading. We don't have those different heading levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's either like on or off when it comes to headings. So you don't have to worry too much about the hierarchy, but there are things you want to consider information-wise to make it clear what information goes together. Keeping screens small where possible helps with that. And just making sure you've made sure you've identified where there are headings. You don't have to worry about the heading level side of things.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. Next one is kind of a comment, but also kind of a question from, I believe it's Rinku. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Is there any kind of information, Claire, that you can give about carousels?
Yes, I'd recommend if you are building a carousel, check out that authoring practices guide first. They've got some information on where or how the keyboard should work for a carousel. I do recommend, however, thinking about why you're using a carousel. Is it to show product images? Is it advertising? Or is it, say, a typical carousel you might see where there's a bunch of news articles? because carousels can be a really tricky thing to get right from an accessibility point of view. But when it comes to things like, say, displaying a bunch of news articles on your homepage, they're quite often not very successful from a click-through rate. Quite often people don't click to the next page of a carousel for those types of showing a bunch of articles, for example, and there's a few off the edge of the screen. Quite often it's just people want all their content on the homepage all at once, but users don't quite often click through them. So have a think about why you're adding it. Perhaps think about, is there a different component that would work better than a carousel? But if it does have to be a carousel, like a bunch of product images, for example, check out, Julie's just added a specific link in the chat. Thank you, Julie, for the carousels one. And then have a think about, in particular, how your keyboard patterns are going to work, because that's the biggest challenge when it comes to accessibility. But there's heaps of information on there to get you started.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. I'm going to keep this rolling along because we are actually getting quite a few questions coming through, which is fantastic. The next question we've got is from Anna, and Anna writes, was the decision to place the card heading in the reading order before the date based on the user with disabilities research, as I don't quite see 1.3.2 failure here if the date is focused first, as the overall card meaning is not affected?
This is just something that is more of a usability point of view than a WCAG thing, in that when people are navigating specifically via headings, which is one of the most common ways a screen reader user may navigate, quite often if there's, say, information that's related to the heading above it, you may miss out on it. And I included this in this example just specifically because it comes up a lot. We find in audits or consultation work we do, particularly with cards, when they have dates or tags or an image above the heading, and it can be quite a common thing that comes up. But we do recommend, as designers, we're looking at UX and accessibility and everything together. So extending a little bit past WCAG can be a bit easier at the design stage, particularly if you work for an organization that's very WCAG compliance focused. It can be a bit easier to bring the usability side in more when you're at the design stage. So while that's not really looking at a particular WCAG failure, it's more of a common usability, accessibility thing that comes up.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire. Next question that I have is from Daniel, and Daniel writes, from what I can tell, skip to content / regions is underutilized in the market. Is this level A or double A? And any reasons why this may be? Is there kind of a lack of education around this?
Yes, so this is related specifically to a criteria called bypass blocks. Perhaps one of my Intopia people in the chat can tell me whether that's an A or a double A. I'm not too sure off the top of my head, but it is a WCAG-related thing. And if you have blocks of content that's repeated on multiple pages, quite often, like that skip to content example, you may have a header with lots of links. Every time someone wants to tab with the keyboard, they have to tab through all the links in the header, and it can be quite exhausting to get down to the main content. So that's where a skip to content link comes really handy. I recommend, if you haven't looked into this before from a design point of view, check out a little bit around skip to content links. They can be really important for keyboard users with mobility issues, for example, where it may be more time consuming or painful to press tab 100 times to get through your really big mega menu to get down to the content. You can also use them for different things, like perhaps you've got a shopping cart. You don't want to have someone tab through the 1,000 items they added to the shopping cart to get to the checkout button. So you perhaps could have a skip to checkout option. There's lots of different ways you can use them, but thinking about that at the design stage and thinking, is it going to be difficult for users to get to different features? Do I have a big complex app? The most common scenario you'll be looking at is, say, if you have more than 5 or 6 links in a header, you'd want to start considering adding a skip to main content link.
Perfect, thanks. Our next question is an anonymous question. What do you think is the best way to annotate for screen reader behaviors?
Starting with just what we looked at with our keyboard patterns can be a really important starting point, in that we want to make sure all our components are nice and keyboard accessible just as a baseline. As part of the annotation kit, we've got all these little note functions with some templates for you to add more complex information if you're, say, working really closely with your developers, or you can write or read code and you want to add more complicated information. There is templates in there available for things like adding role and state and other property information for components. So if you want to go that way for more role, state, name information for components, there are templates in there. The authoring practices guide has all that same information as it does for keyboard patterns, for screen reader behavior. So you can use that as a reference and start practice adding all that in if you like, making sure that each component has the role and the state information or any properties it needs all documented up front.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. Next up, I'm just going to combine a couple of questions together just because they tend to touch on the same topic. We've got a question from Marley, which says, is there anything in the way of multimedia, i.e. audio, video, annotations that are standard or common? And we also have the question from Jillian, which says, what is the best practice in designing a video component?
So when it comes to video components in general, there are probably some that are more accessible than others. Perhaps, I saw Julie talking before, perhaps Julie, if you have a top 3 recommendation when it comes to video players, some of them you can use are just nice and accessible by default. So you don't have to worry about someone actually interacting with the video player itself, and you can focus on making sure that your media content is accessible. So making sure that you've referenced what the kind of WCAG will provide some nice guidance, and the W3C have a bunch of documentation around how you should provide captions or transcripts or audio description for media. So just being able to focus on that side of things can be really important. Just pick an accessible media player for your website, and then you don't have to worry about how someone's going to interact with the media player, and you can focus more on what kind of alternatives are required. Then from a design point of view, perhaps at your design system level, if you have one documenting what types of media need what types of alternatives, so your media team can help produce them up front. And then perhaps if you have a one-off in a page documenting the features that are required in your design, like here's where the transcript will go, here's where the captions will go, everything like that, so that people can see that that's included in your designs, where the features should be, that kind of thing.
Perfect, thank you. Next question that we've got is from Anna, and Anna writes, if the pages are based on the already reviewed and accessible design library, so there is no need to review the individual components again, what should we focus our design reviews on?
Yes, so one thing I would look at is making sure that the heading hierarchy is maintained in your page. Once you've glued all your components together in a page, making sure that that beautiful heading hierarchy is maintained. Also, that more complex keyboard focus patterns. So you want to make sure that once you've got a few components together, the keyboard management between all your components is going to be well documented and works well, especially for dynamic things like when something pops up or you click this, where's it going to go? Where's the focus going to land between pages? And looking at those more complicated interactions at a page or a workflow level. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. Just one thing I'm going to quickly call out just before I go to the next question. There are some really helpful links that are being shared in chat by people who are joining the webinar today. Just a helpful tip, please do make sure that you are sending those chat messages to everybody. There are a couple of messages which have some really useful information that are only going to myself, Claire, and the captioners, and it would be wonderful if that information was shared with everybody. So do make sure you are sending your chat messages to everyone. Next question that we've got for you, Claire, another anonymous one. Does using parallax scrolling on websites and apps impact accessibility?
Yes, this is probably another one where it extends a little bit past WCAG. WCAG doesn't cover animations at the AAA level very well, but when it comes to any type of animation, the more space it takes up on your screen, the more likely it is to impact someone using it. So quite often parallax effects take up the whole screen and they have large effects when you're scrolling through. So they're the type of things that probably impact people the most, particularly people with vestibular disorders, inner ear disorders, where they may feel nauseous or get migraines, etc., from really large animations. This can be more of a problem when, say, scrolling in a different direction on the screen to what your mouse is moving. That's one that quite often makes me quite ill, is just with someone with motion sickness. But when you are looking at animations, try to think about how much of the screen is it taking up. Perhaps try and make effects that take up less than half the screen, and make sure that you're looking into things such as preferred reduced motion and media queries that support people's operating system level settings. So all operating systems have some kind of turn off animation or reduce animation setting that you can support in your CSS. So talk to your developers and work out their preferred reduced motion. Perhaps if you do have existing animations on the site, you can support those settings so that if someone knows that they're going to get sick from that type of thing, they can turn it off, and then you can turn off the animations on your site. But one of the key things is to just think about, why is it there? Is it just to look cool, or is it part of your brand identity? Try to think about why the animations are there, and then try and make them maybe perhaps a bit smaller and subtler. It's the main advice I'd give.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Our next question is from Patrick, and Patrick writes, how do you balance annotating designs without overwhelming developers?
One of the things I find good is when people are collaborating on it. So it's less likely for someone to be overwhelmed. Say if you have a design handover and you drop your designs on a dev team and there's 1,000 annotations on it, that's going to be a bit, whoa, there's a lot of stuff going on. But if you're kind of working with people, perhaps your developers come into Figma and have a little play around and add some annotations themselves, the more collaborative approach you have, the easier it is for everyone, particularly people like being in on the decision-making process. And accessibility does impact so many roles for just a simple thing like alternative text on an image. You have to have someone write the alternative text, make a decision about whether it's there, the developer has to implement it. So the more people you get in on it, the less overwhelming it's going to seem, instead of it just having a hard handover. That doesn't work all the time though. Sometimes you're stretched for time, you just have to hand over some stuff. So having the annotations there is going to be more helpful than not having them there, because that just means you're passing the decision making onto the next person. So say if I haven't designed any of my keyboard focus states because I was pressed for time, I'm just passing that time I saved by not doing it onto my developer, who then has to go, crap, what's the keyboard focus going to look like, and have to then pass that decision on. So the more time, even if it is a bit overwhelming or time consuming, if you don't do it, it's kind of just passing that buck on to the next person, who then has to think about it. So it kind of just has that cost benefit you have to think about.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Thank you. Next question that we have is from Joseph, and Joseph writes, is there anything to be aware of when considering design annotations for accessibility in desktop versus mobile versions of websites?
Probably maybe like what we talked about with the mobile app. I think most of the annotations I have in my kit have the heading levels, versus a mobile app, you wouldn't need the level information. So like things like that you'd have to think about, but that's more of a decision-making process. Probably I'd look at, when it comes to annotating in general, you want them to be nice and clear and not in the way. So I like to put them all on a special layer so that people can turn them on and off, or have the clean version and the annotated version next to each other. Similar with mobile, because you want to fit a lot of stuff on a smaller screen, just be more considerate about where you're adding stuff. It's not covering up anything, or it's easy to toggle them on and off, or two versions, whatever, because it's less screen real estate to annotate things than when you're annotating the desktop version, probably would be the main thing.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. We've got time for one last question, and this question is from Div. Can screen readers pick up disabled fields? How do we design disabled states, e.g. disabled form fields?
Yes, so a screen reader will pick up that it's a disabled thing, particularly if you're just using a standard HTML component. They'll announce what it is and that it's disabled, dimmed, whatever screen reader you're using. So they're not going to ignore it if it's disabled. Someone will still be able to find it and hear that it's disabled when they're navigating with a screen reader. With disabled states, just be careful about when say you have a disabled text field, have a think about whether it's disabled in that someone can't enter anything, or perhaps it's read only and people have to be able to read what's in there to review it. Perhaps they can't change the information, but they have to read it. Make sure it's still readable if that's the case. Perhaps design it a little bit differently than a standard disabled text field, because you want someone to be able to read the text but not edit it. Similarly, with one thing that's important to consider is things like buttons. Try not to disable buttons if you can avoid it, something like, say, a next button in a form, because it can be more of a harder pattern for people to use. I think Zoe had a presentation recently around disabled buttons. I can't remember what it was for. Was that for Ali Camp or something similar, Crispy, if you can remember?
I think, yeah, Zoe's presented on it quite a few times. I'm just gonna...
That would be a really good one to dive into if you want to learn a little bit more around why we recommend not disabling things. That one's one of my favorites. I'm a bit biased though, working with Zoe, that it's my favorite one, but I'm sure you'll find it really good too once we add it to the chat for you. But those will be the main things to think about. Why it's disabled. Does someone still need to read the information or not? Would be the main hard part around disabled fields.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And just for context, for anyone that might be wanting to find specifically Zoe, it is Zoe Horton, so ZoeHaughton. She's typically on all forms of social media, including Twitter and LinkedIn, and is doing quite a few different presentations. So be sure to keep an eye out on both her and our social media. We've just had one very quick final question that's just come through, so we just might sneak it in. It's a question from Bobby, and Bobby asks, is it possible to get more detail on the missed graph from the start of the talk?
Yeah, I think if you do a search for like NIST, software development, cost of work, you'll find heaps of stuff on it. It's a really common one in that it's everywhere. So that would be a really easy one to find. If they're the keywords you'd want to use is NIST graph, cost of rework, software development lifecycle, and you'd be able to find heaps of articles about explaining it in a lot more detail around the different stages of the software development life cycle and the cost of rework and everything. There'll be heaps of stuff for you.
Perfect, thank you so much. And with that comes the end of question time. So thank you so much, Claire, for a fantastic presentation. So much information, so many useful resources. As Claire said, we will make sure that we share both the recording of this webinar after the event, as well as links to all of the resources. We'll have them available on our website, as well as through social media. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone for coming. Just a bit of a plug, if you are interested in learning more specifically about designing for accessibility, we do have a couple of offers that are available to everyone. This is for people who are both joining us live in the webinar or maybe watching the on-demand recording. We are offering a 10% discount for our Designing for Digital Accessibility course, which kicks off in May. The course, I believe, happens to be facilitated by you, Claire, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you like hearing me and you're a weirdo, then feel free to hear more from me.
So yeah, if you're interested in that, we have all of the information of the course available on our website. When you go through the checkout process, you can enter a promotion code of design 10, that's design 10, and that will give you a 10% discount specifically to the May Designer course. If you are interested in getting designing for accessibility training for your whole team, we are also offering a 10% discount on that as well. Please do get in touch with us through the Contact Us page on the Intopia website at intopia.digital. Mention the fact that you heard about the offer through the webinar, and we'll make sure that that discount gets factored in to your training request. We will be running these webinars on an ongoing basis. We're hoping to run them once every month or so. We will have details of the next webinar shortly through both our social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and you can find us just at Intopia on all of those. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter. You can head to our homepage at intopia.digital, and there's a small form down on the bottom of the screen where you can subscribe to the newsletter, where you'll get to hear about everything that we're doing, as well as everything that's happening in the accessibility community. We do try and share a lot of resources and things that come out so that it's not necessarily all just from us. So it's a fantastic resource for anyone wanting to learn more about accessibility. As mentioned, we will have a recording of this webinar that will be made available on our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll promote that when it's available. Thank you again to AI Media for providing our live captioning. Thank you to everyone for coming along to today's webinar, and hopefully we will catch you at the next one. Thank you so much.